The following program is a UWTV classic.
From the University of Washington in Seattle, Upon Reflection.
Hello and welcome to Upon Reflection. I'm Marcia Alvar. Is a truly race-neutral society possible? That's the central question explored in Colorblind, a new book by Ellis Cose that looks at the state of race relations in the United States, Latin America, and in the newly emerging nation of post-apartheid South Africa. Cose is a contributing editor for Newsweek magazine, former chairman of the editorial board at the New York Daily News, and author of several books, including The Press, A Nation of Strangers, and The Rage of a Privileged Class. Welcome to Upon Reflection.
Well, thank you for having me, Marcia.
Let's talk first about defining some terms and the difference between the words that you used for your title, colorblind. So what the difference would be between colorblind and race neutral?
Yeah, and I do draw a distinction between the two. I mean, colorblind has actually a couple of different meanings.
You hear it a lot. People
hear it a lot, and it's come to mean to some people a sense of we just don't see color. We just don't see color at all.
Do you believe people when they say that?
No, I think, but I think it's, and that's why I think the term's a little bit confusing, because it's used by people who say we don't see color. It's also used by people who say, in effect, that we just treat people equally, irrespective of color. And so I thought it would be useful, and of course there's the original definition, which goes back to 1896 when John Marshall Harlan used it in his dissent to Plessy versus Ferguson, and he was saying that the Constitution should be colorblind. There shouldn't be one set of laws for blacks and one set of laws for whites. But I think, at least for my purposes, I use the term race neutral because I think it's a little bit less confusing. And what I say is that race neutrality is a state where we don't punish people for their color, where we don't penalize people for their race or ethnicity. And also, I think one of the problems with color blindness is that it sort of implies an impossible reality. I mean, clearly we do see color, or unless we are in true fact blind.
Relations between blacks and whites, it's become a kind of, almost a quid pro quo, maybe that's not the right phrase for it, but the idea of reverse discrimination, that somehow there's an equality without context.
That actually is reflected in the polls. Lou Harris, the pollster, talks about this, but others do as well, where whites have concluded that it is that the discrimination that they face is equivalent in some way to the discrimination that blacks face, that the playing field has been not only leveled, but perhaps leveled too far, or leveled, that things have gone over too far in the direction that whites are victims as opposed to racial and ethnic minorities. And that's certainly racial and ethnic minorities have all kinds of advantages now that whites don't have.
I was thinking there was a debate that's gone on for some time. August Wilson, the playwright, is involved in it, and he has been a passionate advocate for the need for a black theater, that you can't simply preserve and transmit black culture in mainstream theater. He's accused of being a racist. Why do you need a black theater? What was integration about? And that's when I talk about this quid pro quo. There seems to be a suspicion of anything that involves black culture in any way, shape, or form different from or separate from white culture.
Well, I think there is a difficulty that a lot of people have in understanding what's going on, and I think there's a large degree of denial involved very often in those kinds of discussions. I think some fellow called me up once. I was on a talk radio show, and we were talking about the need to have diverse staffs on magazines and newspapers. And the guy called up very angry, some very angry sort of white fellow, and he says, "Well, I bet that they don't have a bunch of white people working at Ebony." And his point seemed to be that if in fact we're going to have some kind of equality, then we ought to start by making the black publications hire a lot of white people. The reality obviously is...
This is a logic that a lot of people seem to have, that it's unfair somehow for there to be anything that white people aren't involved in now, maybe because of the civil rights movement, maybe because I'm thinking aloud here, but it's a puzzle that I find hard to unravel. This unhappiness with anything that isn't come along and be part of the larger mainstream.
I don't even know if it's unhappiness. I think what it is it's a way of saying, it's a way of excusing white institutions that don't have many blacks. It's a way of excusing discrimination very often. It's a way of saying, well, we're not the only ones who do it. You blacks do this too, or you Latinos do this too. You have Univision. Why do you need your own television network? Why can't you just be part of ours? It's a way of saying that. It's a way of diffusing criticism, and that gets into I think one of the points in my book where I talk about the sort of dominant dialogue. It's this dialogue in race, which is often the dialogue of sort of blame and guilt, of sort of one party saying it's your fault and the other party saying, well, no, it's not my fault. And it seems to me another way of saying I'm not responsible. That is not just one side here. That in this instance, it's not just whites who do things on the basis of race, but it's you people too. So I don't really take it as an attempt to get to some kind of color blindness or race neutrality. I take it as one of these sort of psychological things that people do to deal with race in this country.
One of the most fascinating aspects of this book is the experience that you had visiting South Africa, which is at a moment in its history that's very unique, very interesting. There seem to be some parallels to what happened in this country in the late 50s and early 60s.
There are many parallels, and also, as you say, a lot of things that are not parallel at all, because the structure of the country and the history are both very different there. But what I found particularly interesting was I was there February of last year for most of the month, and at the point where I was there was this dispute going on in one of the northern provinces, a dispute essentially over school desegregation. There was a black civil servant, who wanted to enroll his child in an Afrikaner school. And the Afrikaners were basically saying, no, you can't. We have a right to our own schools, we have a right to our own culture. You're going to ruin it if you come in here, and if other black Africans start coming in here because they're not part of our culture. And it became sort of symbolic throughout the country of this struggle over the old guard and the new guard. And ultimately it ended up with there being protest marches and there being all kinds of publicity, and finally the court told the school they had to admit not only this black student but several other black students who in the interim had joined the case. But it took me back to the United States and its sort of struggle with desegregation. And I think in a sense it illuminated both of the similarities and the differences, because even though there was this big resistance in South Africa, it collapsed very quickly because there's a majority black government and there's a sense of equality that they're serious about because they have to be serious about. Whereas here, it was fought at every turn, and the Supreme Court came up with this concept of with all deliberate speed, which meant sort of when you get around to it, and it never really happened, and to this date, never really happened. But I was also struck by another thing in South Africa. I was struck by the sense of optimism, and you find it all over the country. The sense of idealism, the sense of hope that they're going to get beyond this very quickly, and it reminded me a little bit of the U.S. Back in the late 60s and early 70s, say, when there was this feeling that maybe the next generation in a few years is going to get beyond all this racial stuff. And of course we found out that it didn't happen here, and it'd be interesting to see what they found out in South Africa, because I think that as is the way when you're starting a new government and a new approach, you tend to be very, very optimistic about what's going to happen.
Do you think that the key difference, one of the reasons that at least from this distance, it seems like this transition, it's like night and day from apartheid to the system that's in place now, just being built now, that it's black majority rule, and that for whites in the country, it's not like a big choice. This is the future. This is our society.
It's clear that it's futile to resist the whole idea of equality within law and within certain institutions, because there is simply just no support for that. And that was obviously very different than was the case in the United States. What's also true, though, and this is a little bit below the surface, so to speak, is that there are some huge structural inequalities that they're going to still have to figure out how to deal with. You have unemployment among blacks in South Africa of upwards of 40%. It's a huge number. You have a disparity in income that makes the disparities in income in the United States look laughable. Comparable, well, perhaps with Brazil, but it makes those United States just very small by comparison. And they're trying to balance several things in South Africa. They're trying to balance the need to redress that, and they're experimenting with affirmative action and other things as well, along with the need to get along with the whites who are there, to get along with the coloreds who are a significant part of the population there as well, to sort of, on one hand, make up for all the evils of apartheid without disrupting the sort of delicate balance that they have in terms of a society, and it's going to be obviously very difficult.
It means a kind of forgiveness that is difficult for some people to imagine.
It means forgiveness, but it means more than forgiveness, because I was talking to the head of the South African Council of Churches, a woman, a very impressive woman named Brigadier Bam, and she hit on that very issue of forgiveness, and the South African Council of Churches, the building she worked in, was bombed shortly after she arrived there, and she was saying that, it's very difficult to forgive people who did these awful things, but we have to if we're going to go ahead as a country. We just have to, because otherwise you get sort of stuck in recrimination and going nowhere. But even beyond that, they have the whole issues of how do you really deal with the fact that the blacks, the Africans, by and large, are so very, very poor, and the whites, by and large, are so very, very privileged there. And how do you deal with that when the base of that privilege is an unfair system, but you're committed not to stripping them of their lands or of their property? That's a very difficult issue, and it's one that I think they're going to continue to wrestle with.
It's an issue that hasn't been wrestled with as much in this country. There's a story in this book that you say was told by, I think, Willie Brown, who's now the mayor of San Francisco. The poker game analogy. Talk about that and this whole business.
What his story basically is, what if you have a poker game and one person, in effect, has basically just stolen everything and has all the chips. So then you sit down with one person with this huge stack of chips and the other person with a couple of chips, and you say, okay, now the playing field is level. So
now we'll all play fair.
Now we'll all play fair. Well, unless the person with the one or two chips is extremely fortunate, there's no way that he's ever going to get to the point of the guy with all the chips. And what do you do in that situation? I mean, we as a country are at least sort of looking at that issue. I think South Africa is having to look at it much more seriously. And that of course is the sort of thing that affirmative action was designed to try to deal with. But then we go back to the psychology that we were talking about before. I mean, Americans tend to have a very short view of history. Americans tend to say, in effect, well, wait a minute. What happened 100 years ago or 200 years ago has nothing to do with me. And in a sense it does, in a sense it doesn't. You say, well, you can't inherit blame, you can't inherit guilt. Well, it's just probably true. But you certainly can inherit property. And to this day, even among middle-class blacks and middle-class whites, there's a huge disparity in terms of what kind of property they have, even if they make the same amount of income, most of it having to do with the legacy of discrimination and the legacy of inherited wealth. And clearly in this country, we aren't going to go into a major redistribution of wealth if we actually seem to be going the opposite direction, if anything. But I think that the question that we have to sort of face as a society, and that we tend not to face because we are ahistorical, is how do you deal with the lingering inequities that are very clear?
What's interesting, and you devote a fair amount of the book to a discussion of affirmative action, which has gotten to be one of those issues like abortion for which there seems to be no resolution. But it struck me that I don't know if has there ever been like a commission to explore affirmative action, to define it, what it is, what's worked about it, what hasn't worked about it?
I'm not aware of a commission as such. I mean, there have obviously been congressional committees which have looked at it. President Clinton obviously had a review of affirmative action. The Office of Federal Contract Compliance periodically does various studies, but I don't think anyone has sort of sat back and done a very sort of dispassionate commission look at affirmative action. And I'm not sure anyone really could, because it's one of these issues that, first of all, people tend to come to with some sort of ideological baggage. It's an issue that tends to elicit all kinds of emotions from people. And the results of it are very difficult to measure, because affirmative action means so many different things. And I mean, there are government definitions and legal definitions, but it means so many different things that it was probably impossible with any precision to measure what the results have been and what disadvantage to whites has been created by it. It's just not a simple mathematical computation.
And why affirmative action always has a black face on it as opposed to the face of a white woman?
Well, a lot of people who look at this will argue convincingly, I think, that the largest beneficiaries of affirmative action are white women. And yet white women are never sort of demonized with affirmative action. But I think that speaks to our own preoccupations as a country, our own sort of particular way of looking at race. I mean, this is a sort of similar issue in preference in university admissions. I mean, people have observed that if you look at other preferences, you look at preferences for legacies who are the sons and daughters of people who went to Harvard or some other university before. If you look at, say, athletes, if you look at people who get dispensation because they're from geographical areas or because they're musicians or any array of reasons, those sets of preferences overwhelm the sort of racial preferences.
And they're not running around campus saying, I don't deserve to be here,
and
why
they're not
should
saying
I
I don't
be
deserve
here?
to be here, and people aren't marching saying get rid of all these preferences for these undeserving legacies who are getting into schools and therefore have the stigma attached to them.
Someone you quote extensively in one section of the book is a name familiar to people in Seattle, and it's Constance Rice. And Constance says that really there is in some sense, a simple explanation for this, and it's politics, that there is political hay to be made out of finding somebody to lightning rod all your anxieties about and all your worries on. And affirmative action has fit the bill wonderfully in that score.
Well, sure, in the sense, if you're going to try to have a big political campaign, you don't want to basically target women, given the numbers of women in society. And it's easier to sort of target some ethnic groups, but I'm not so sure that all of it's consciously political. I mean, I think a lot of it is that people, particularly white males, are just sort of fixated on the affirmative action that has to do with ethnic and racial minorities, and particularly with blacks, and because this is one that seems to them particularly offensive.
One of the things that's not in the book that I was kind of surprised was missing was a discussion of the military. As you glance sort of briefly on sports, which is another area of our society which, because of the larger goals involved in athletic competition, represents in some ways an achievement in terms of integration. The military, I would think, at least that my impression of it is that's another area that has been more integrated, more successful in that regard than many other aspects
There's no question
of our
about
society.
that. I mean, there's a fellow, and I forget exactly whose quote it is, but who makes the observation that it's only in the military that you have large numbers of whites being bossed around by large numbers of blacks. It's a sort of unique environment. And it's certainly, and actually there are a couple books out now that try to look at the military experience. And it's an interesting one. And there are parallels, I think, but also some obvious differences between what the military can do and what sort of civilian society can do. I mean, one obvious one is the command structure. You don't have the same kind of command structure outside of the Army, where you order that these things be done, these policies get implemented, and they get implemented in the same sort of way. You don't have the same lever to ensure that a commitment is followed through that you do in the military. But I think there's some clear lessons to be learned from what the military has done.
But I was interested in that you make the point that in the workplace there is a fair degree of integration, but we live still in largely segregated worlds, go to school in largely segregated worlds, worship, that there's so much separation, some mingling. In the military you would have this situation where everyone is together pretty much all the time, and wondered if it does truly create a more, if you can get away from the command structure, a more race-neutral social interaction among the people who are in the armed forces.
I'm not aware of a study that seriously looks at that. I'm sure there are some, but I'm just not aware of one that seriously looks at that. But it's clear that you see soldiers fraternalizing and associating with one another. But also, many of the military people that I've talked to have talked about how black soldiers and white soldiers often go their own separate ways too. So I think you have a combination of things going on there. But I think that there is more of that than there is in civilian society.
You do some speculating in the book about the potential impact of if affirmative action were done away with. Talk a bit about what kind of impact you think it would have if it were taken from the books.
That all depends on how it's taken away, Marcia. I mean, the obvious sort of target of a lot of activity now is what's happening in university admissions and university campuses, and particularly with elite universities. And it's being fueled, or at least a lot of the focus of that is what's been happening at the University of California and within the University of California system, because the regents decided to basically abolish racial preferences there, and then
got
Proposition
kind of
209.
embarrassed a little later.
Well, it got embarrassed because some of them were practicing a sort of preferential treatment of their own in trying to get people in through the back door of UCLA who didn't meet the standards, and who in most cases, who in all cases that I'm aware of, didn't happen to be any kind of ethnic or racial minority either. So there was a certain amount of hypocrisy involved there. But the numbers that have been run at UC Berkeley, and I think it's consistent across a lot of other elite institutions, are that you would reduce fairly dramatically the numbers of at least blacks and Latinos in some of these institutions if you threw out affirmative action and then started admitting solely on the basis of GPA, of test scores, and grade point averages. But no one, I think, is seriously going to do that. But if you just did that, and then it looks like you might reduce by as much as 75%, the numbers of minorities in some of these institutions. But the fact of the matter is that no institution that I'm aware of at this point admits solely on the basis, putting racial considerations aside, admits solely on the basis of GPA and test scores. They don't just automatically say at Harvard, well, if you've got a 1500 SAT and you got a GPA of 3.8, you're automatically into Harvard. They just don't do that, and they've never done that.
Going beyond, let's say if the admission of students is the rock that hits the water, the ripples that you talk about in the book, I thought that in the field of medicine it was particularly interesting what the impact would be if indeed admissions were cut back
severely.
Yeah,
I mean, there are some researchers, University of California, San Francisco, who tried to look at what determines where a person practices medicine. And what they ended up coming up with was that the largest determinant they could find was race. That, in effect, white doctors tended to practice in white areas, black doctors tended to practice in black areas, and Latino doctors were much more likely to practice in areas with significant populations of Latinos. What that says is that it's very likely, at the very least, if you reduce radically the number of blacks who you are educating in medical school, you're likely to reduce radically the number of people who serve black communities, who are doctors. And the conservative or the anti-affirmative action response to this is very often, well, you don't need affirmative action, just select people who want to work in these communities. But it seems difficult to get around what seems to be an unfortunate racial reality, which is that a large part of what determines who wants to work in these communities is the race of the person.
We have just a couple of minutes left, and the book has a number of, I guess it's our propensity for 12-step programs. You have 12 steps talking about building better relations between the races. But who will lead, or do we need, is that another old model that we need leaders, somebody to step forward and advocate? And
well, I think we certainly need leaders, but I don't think that leaders take care of the problem for us, and I think we've been very unfortunate in terms of our political arena that the level of leadership generally on this issue has been more often than not the leadership that I think polarizes us than one that takes us in the opposite direction. So I think we certainly need leaders, and we certainly could profit from having better ones. But I think in terms of how we approach race, in terms of how we approach each other, we're talking in some measure as well about individual responsibility and how we decide as individuals to deal with one another, and how we decide as individuals to see this issue and this problem.
But it's 99 out of 100 books on this issue are always written by black authors.
I haven't done an analysis. I'm not sure that's true. I'll have to ask Mr. Hacker.
Well, Andrew Hack, he is one great exception.
Whether he agrees with that. Joe Fagan is another one. I mean, there are certainly more whites now who are writing books on race, but I think you're right. If you just look at sort of the proportion, it tends to be something that blacks are more concerned about, and I think it's for an obvious reason that blacks tend to be more directly affected by, impacted by discrimination and issues of race than whites do.
Well, you should talk to Andrew Hacker. That would be interesting to find out, and it would be encouraging if it were indeed true that many more whites are also writing books about race. My thanks, Ellis Cose. We're out of time. Your new book, Colorblind. Come back again.
My pleasure.
To see more UWTV classics, visit uwtv.org/classics.